transatlantic slave trade is a dark period in human history that is often talked about. However, the full extent of this tragic episode is not always known. Many stories remain untold, and many of the experiences of those who were enslaved have been lost to history. In this video, we're going to uncover some of the untold stories of the transatlantic slave trade. First, it's important to understand the scope of the transatlantic slave trade. It lasted for over 400 years and involved the kidnapping and forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. The practice of slavery is not unique to the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery has been a part of human history for thousands of years. However, the transatlantic slave trade was different in that it involved the mass movement of people across the Atlantic Ocean. Many of those who were captured and sold into slavery were not from the cities and towns that we often associate with Africa. They were from small villages and rural areas. These were people who had very little contact with the rest of the world. They were not aware of the existence of the Americas and had no idea what was in store for them. Once the slaves arrived in the Americas, they were sold to plantation owners who used them to work the land. The conditions on these plantations were often brutal. The slaves were forced to work long hours in the hot sun and were given very little food or water. They were also subjected to physical and sexual abuse. Perhaps the most tragic part of the transatlantic slave trade is the fact that the enslaved were not considered to be human beings. They were seen as mere property that could be bought, sold, and traded at will. This meant that they had no right and were not entitled to any of the freedoms that we take for granted today. Despite the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, there were many instances of resistance and rebellion. Some slaves ran away and formed communities of their own in remote areas. Others rebelled against their owners and fought for their freedom. The transatlantic slave trade finally came to an end in the 19th century when many countries around the world abolished slavery. However, the legacy of the slave trade continues to this day. The effects of slavery can still be seen in the racial inequalities that exist in many parts of the world. In conclusion, the transatlantic slave trade was a dark and tragic period in human history. The untold stories of the millions of people who were enslaved during this time represent a collective loss of human experience that can never be fully recovered. However, by learning about this period of history, we can gain a deeper understanding of the struggles and sacrifices of those who fought for freedom and dignity.